won't be solved overnight. Most important to keep in mind, however, is that it also won't be solved at all by the armies of armchair generals that have sprung up overnight on Twitter and Facebook and in the mainstream media. The same people lecturing us and condescending to the American people with blatantly false information about the phony China virus pandemic are the same ones now telling us what to believe about the war in Ukraine. They have this down to a science and can tell us exactly how outraged we should be and how much this is all Trump's fault, because he's still in office, apparently, and Joe Biden is incapable of screwing up. Curious how Biden hasn't been responsible for any of the disasters that have happened since he took office. The truth is, the conflict in Ukraine goes back decades. This isn't something that just happened because Putin is evil. But that's exactly what you'd expect from the orange man bad crowd. Geopolitics are complicated, and the conflict we're seeing today has its roots in the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the 90s, and even well before that. It's important to remember the situation isn't black and white. Russia isn't some Hollywood villain, and the United States isn't some noble, angelic savior. In fact, our government has been operating behind the scenes in Ukraine for many years. And under Obama, the CIA appears to have been funding and even training the neo-Nazi fascist Ukrainians in the Azov Battalion, specifically to fight Russia. If that sounds too wild to believe, consider that the U.S. has already done it many times before, most recently in Syria with Operation Timber Sycamore. Look it up, where the CIA pumped over $1 billion into training and arming actual Islamic terrorists who were guilty of committing war crimes and brutally murdering innocent civilians. The U.S. government did that. It's an indisputable fact. Now, we're meddling in Ukraine and once again being asked to believe that unless you support our corrupt government who has lied to us about every single war for the last 70 years, you're somehow unpatriotic. To be clear, One America News is not standing with Russia or with Ukraine, but with the truth. OAN firmly believes our leaders should put America's interests first and not instigate and fight proxy wars on behalf of globalist elites. All of this has been carefully documented and recorded by dedicated journalists on the ground in Ukraine, but many are being overshadowed by their corrupt media counterparts, who are only too happy to spoon-feed the American public carefully worded lies and propaganda to protect the interests of those in power. We'd like to show you an excerpt from an upcoming film by the legendary director Oliver Stone, who worked tirelessly to investigate and document exactly what's happening in Ukraine and why. The truth is rarely simple and never convenient, but this short film helps give some context to the events that we're seeing today.
This morning, Kiev awoke to the sound of gunfire.
Protesters behind homemade shields walking into live fire.
What we saw here today was a revolution. For the second time in a decade, Ukraine has ousted its president, dealing a massive blow to Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Мы считаем, что украинское правительство пришло к власти демократическим путем.
Yanukovych, who has kept Ukraine closely tied to Russia, has fled the capital.
Господин Байден говорил одно, а в Украине делали другое.
We of course never choose candidates in any country.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience, and, the EU.
You had this remarkable phone call where you have these two senior officials of the U.S. government apparently talking about a coup.
Госпереворот совершили. С нами разговаривать не хотят. У нас какие мысли? Следующий шаг. Украина в НАТО.
The West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path, and the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. Создавалось такое впечатление, что в посольстве Соединенных Штатов существует штаб.
The free world is with you.
America is with you. I am with you.
So the CIA has been developing fascist assets in the Ukraine for 70 years.
You had Crimea wanting to break away.
Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a treaty to make Crimea part of Russia.
Eastern Ukraine resisting. Things rapidly escalated.
Поруби, Тимошенко, Аваков, Коломойский. Вот те люди, которые готовили бойню в Одессе.
Mariupol, are you in favor of the Donetsk People's Republic?
Ukrainian acting president Alexander Turchinov has called the vote a step into the abyss.
Господин Турчин, который фактически начал войну, он несет огромную ответственность. Он начал войну против собственного народа.
Petro Poroshenko has promised to reform the economy and fight corruption. His role in the protests against the former regime give him credibility.
Слава Украине!
He presents himself as a unifying candidate who can reconcile the east and west of the country.
У нас діти підуть до школи, до дитячих садків. У них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах.
If anybody had any thoughts that this conflict was going to die down after the elections, they can forget about that now.
A breakthrough in Minsk as Putin announces a ceasefire deal following marathon talks to end the fighting in eastern Ukraine.
The sound of the ceasefire in Bisky. In January 2015, new fighting broke out near the town of Debaltseve. On February the 12th, 2015, the Minsk II agreement is signed, but the fighting continues.
The United States is going to use this Ukraine thing at any moment to push towards a hot war.
Нет ведь ни одного шага в сторону исполнения этих Минских соглашений. Они просто не исполняются.
Минские соглашения в этом плане очень нужны.
US troops on Ukrainian soil for a military exercise.
The Ukrainian military is gaining skills alongside US forces and their NATO partners. The US has supplied Ukraine with Javelin anti-tank missile systems. Мы должны в этой связи предпринимать контрмеры. Ситуация напрягает. For decades, Ukraine has acted as an effective buffer zone between NATO and Russia.
Any destabilization in Ukraine affects the interests of Russia.
The war here may be turning into another frozen conflict.
A political earthquake took place in Ukraine this weekend.
He went from playing a president on TV to being one in real life. Volodymyr Zelensky, the new president-elect of Ukraine,
І наше найперше завдання – припинення вогню на Донбасі.
International monitors in eastern Ukraine have reported a rising number of ceasefire violations.
Is there a chance that the Russians could be planning an invasion? Of course, they are ready, but we are also ready. Он целиком и полностью порождение государственного переворота 2014 года. Не признавали и не признают никакого другого решения вопроса Донбасса, кроме военного.
In just 1 week, at least 2,469 times that mortars, artillery, assault rifles or heavy machine guns were fired.
These soldiers are members of what used to be a pro-Ukrainian government paramilitary group called the Azov Battalion. Critics said Azov was a neo-Nazi group.
Что нас беспокоит больше всего? Мы видим разгул неонацистов, националистов, антисемитов.
Я Путину вот, клянусь, и на колени стану, и попрошу, чтобы только Харьков не тронули. Пускай не лезут фашисты сюда. Вот, дай Бог ему здоровья. It's 7 years since war broke out in eastern Ukraine. Since then, more than 13,000 people have been killed and over 1 million uprooted from their homes.
Why do so many Ukrainians hate Russia so much?
The
fear for Russia is that with all of this support from the United States in terms of munitions being sent to the country, that this could bolster confidence in Ukraine to try and resolve the situation in the east of Ukraine by force.
NATO is alarmed about Russia's military buildup on Ukraine's borders.
This is the biggest military buildup they have seen since 2014, and I think everybody in Washington, Brussels, or the European side is taking it very seriously.
We have real concerns about Russia's unusual military activity on the border with Ukraine.
These movements certainly have our attention. Дело в том, что нам некуда уже отходить. Они же нас приперли к такой линии.
That's ridiculous. Let's be clear. Nobody's provoking Putin.
This was how Europe was aligned at the peak of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union fell, these Eastern European countries aligned with the US and NATO.
NATO has expanded into 13 countries, up to the borders of Russia. 13 countries.
США и НАТО приступили к застенчивому освоению территории Украины как театра потенциальных военных действий.
In Kyiv last night, a delivery of nearly 300 Javelin anti-tank missiles and other munitions.
Но когда каждый день прибывает по 4, по 5, а были дни по 8 рейсов, оружие, современного оружия, и это говорит о том, что никто не собирается выполнять никакие Минские соглашения, все готовятся решить этот вопрос силовым путем.
President Biden spoke by phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The call came amid a crisis over Ukraine, where 100,000 Russian troops are massed on Ukraine's borders.
Putin has made it clear he wants to guarantee that Ukraine can never join NATO. A reversal of NATO expansion since 1997.
NATO's door is open, remains open, and that is our commitment.
Що Будапештський меморандум не працює, і усі пакетні рішення 94-го року були поставлені під сумнів. Это и есть та самая красная черта, о которой неоднократно говорил. Они ее перешли.
It has happened. What seemed unthinkable in the 21st century is now underway.
An armored column of 32 tanks have crossed the border from Russia into Ukraine.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that.
Vladimir Putin told the Ukrainian military to lay down their weapons and go home.
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
We're strengthening once more our sanctions against the Kremlin and its collaborator, Lukashenko's regime.
Ukrainian officials are pleading with NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes.
Ukraine is waking up to a second week at war with Russia.
One minor incident could escalate quickly into a full-scale war.
It's a war in which there are no winners. You've got thousands of nuclear weapons aimed towards Russia.
Данные нашей разведки продолжают фиксировать размещение украинскими националистами реактивных и артиллерийских подразделений в жилых кварталах не только в Киеве.
What is Putin's goal here?
Vladimir Putin set out to honor his word of 2007. At the Munich Security Conference, he said,
НАТО выдвигает свои передовые силы к нашим государственным границам. Думаю, очевидно, процесс натовского расширения не имеет никакого отношения к модернизации самого Альянса или к обеспечению безопасности в Европе. И у нас есть справедливое право откровенно спросить, против кого это расширение.
Berlin has agreed to a major armaments delivery, including anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and rocket-propelled grenades.
Does Ukraine have chemical and biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of.
Biolabs in Ukraine. Biolabs.
The war in Ukraine enters its third week. Russia is widening its attack on cities. Airstrikes hit targets in central and western Ukraine, far from the front lines of the fighting.
I would not rule out American troops on the ground. We don't rule out first use nuclear.
Теперь несколько важных, очень важных слов для тех, у кого может возникнуть соблазн со стороны вмешаться в происходящее событие. Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались. Надеюсь, что я буду услышан.
Всю свою жизнь я прожила при войне. Мне 8 лет, я не знаю, когда мирное время, я не знаю, взрослые дяди, которые строили войну, они должны ее прекратить. Она уже длинная, сильная. Надо уже как-то заканчивать с этим.
Are you afraid of something? Yes. The world blowing up.
Again, I shouldn't have to repeat this, but the media stooges love to distort our reports and put words in our mouths. One America News is not taking sides with Vladimir Putin or with Russia. We aren't taking sides with Ukraine either. We're journalists. That means not taking sides at all. That means reporting the truth, as difficult as it may be for some people to hear. Truth takes no sides, and neither should the news. Too often we hear media personalities telling us what to believe or how we should think. That's wrong. It's the very definition of propaganda. Our job is not to convince, but to inform. So hopefully, if enough people share the truth, we can hold those responsible for this war accountable for their crimes, put an end to the needless bloodshed, and save any more lives from being sacrificed in yet another senseless war. For One America News, I'm Pearson Sharp.